One more chance, one more opportunity to fight for that playoff spot, one more opportunity to improve your seeding, and one more opportunity to prepare your team for that playoff matchup. With 6 teams on bye this week, now is the time to nail those streamers and sort out your playoff stashes. So let's get into it on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down, and I hope your fantasy season is going fantastically well to this point. Have you already made the playoffs? Do you have that bye week locked up, or are you still on the outside looking in? Regardless of where you're at, we're going to talk through all the best streamers and stashes for week 14. Now, if you haven't already, make sure you check out our rankings over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Be good if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. Plus, if you've got any questions or comments, or just want to let me know how you're going so far this season, do so in the comments below. Or you can also message me on Instagram at Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. But today we are going to get into our streamers and stashes, and we're going to start off, as we always do, with the quarterbacks. And with 6 teams on bye, including Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, and CJ Stroud, quarterback stashing for week 14 has been something we've been discussing for weeks. And Sam Darnold has always been the guy. So now's the time to pull the trigger. After 3 solid finishes in tough matchups, Darnold takes on the generous Falcons defense that should offer plenty of scoring opportunities. Now, if you missed out on Darnold, maybe you can go for Russell Wilson instead. After pumping the Bengals for 414 yards and 3 touchdowns, Wilson can keep his momentum going against a Browns defense that's struggling against the pass at the moment. He's a strong streaming option in a down week for quarterbacks. Meanwhile, if you need a stash, and frankly, I'm not entirely sure why you would need a stash. I mean, potentially there's no viable options on waivers, but I mean, if there are, you're not going to be able to get most guys anyway. So if you're in the playoffs, you probably have a good quarterback. But I don't know. Let's say you're taking on a powerhouse team in week 15 or 16. You need as much upside as possible. I can imagine you'd probably want to stash then. So I'd suggest Jameis Winston. Jameis has a pair of plus matchups and offers extreme upside, as we saw last week, where he set a record for the Browns passing. And he's especially good when facing teams which score a lot of points, and that should be the case in week 15 in particular. So James is someone you can pick up if you're really desperate to stash someone, but ideally just go with your starting quarterback from week 15 onwards. Running backs, and I mean, no surprises here. With Christian McCaffrey and Jordan Mason heading to IR, Isaac Guerrero will be the top waiver wire pickup this week. And if you have him off waivers, then you should start him. The Bears are most susceptible on the ground, and the 49ers are struggling through the air at the moment. Now, meanwhile, the Buccaneers have lent heavily on Bucky Irving as their lead back in the last few weeks, but Rachaad White has still been heavily involved as well. The Bucs' red zone usage is inconsistent, but against the awful Raiders' run defense, White has plenty of touchdown and receiving upside on a week when Derrick Henry and Jonathan Taylor and Joe Mixon and Brian Robinson and Ramondre Stevenson are all unavailable. Plus, Sean Tucker seems to have been phased out of the offense again. So this is back to being a 2-man backfield in Tampa. I do think White has a good chance of a solid week. Meanwhile, in Jacksonville, Dearness Johnson was a healthy inactive for the Jags, turning the backfield over to Travis Etienne and a now healthy Tank Bigsby. While their usage was based on drive rather than down and distance, that is to say they were used in essentially the same situations as each other. There wasn't a specific receiving back or a specific early down back. I expect in the long term, this situation is probably going to help Etienne more than his younger teammate. Etienne is the better receiving back and is receiving the bulk of the carries at the moment. So while Bigsby is a viable desperation pickup if you just really need someone this week, and I am in some leagues where I've got a few of those other guys, I just need somebody, then you can stream Bigsby. But ultimately, I'd prefer ETN if you're in a shallow league and he's available, or if he's just sitting on your bench. I think he's a good player to slot in for this week. Now, I love my running back stashes. We see a lot of injuries to running backs. Of course, we saw multiple of 49ers running backs, which is not very helpful. But I do think that we have a good chance of seeing some injuries in the latter part of this season. So it's still worth stashing these guys. Though I'd really only be stashing the top guys now that there's so few weeks for those injuries to happen. Braylon Allen is the main guy, and let me talk you through it. I've been high on Braylon Allen all season. You probably know if you've been watching the videos. He's a Breece Hall injury away from having a significant role in an offense that's traditionally been pretty good for running backs. The Jets are quickly falling out of playoff contention while Hall is battling a knee injury. That he's also leading the league in fumbles, and he himself suggested that he should be benched. Of all the league's backups, Allen seems the most likely to vault into a fantasy relevant role during the playoffs. So if he's available, he's a must pick up guy for me. Now, in most leagues, he won't be available. So let's rip through a few other guys who might be. Zach Charbonnet, Tyler Algier, Blake Corum, Ray Davis, all guys who are one injury away from being a clear fantasy starter. Also don't mind Kareem Hunt, Tyjae Spears, Trey Benson. I think they all get a clear role if there's an injury ahead of them. Devin Singletary is even fine. Cam Akers, I think he's going to lose some touches to Ty Chandler if Aaron Jones goes down. But I think he also has some one-week starting ability with Jones getting punished for fumbling a lot. So not impossible that Akers takes over the lead role. Finally, Roschon Johnson and Sincere McCormick are desperation options if you need somebody and you just want to stash a guy because you've got an open bench spot. Now, let's talk wide receivers. For the wide receivers I like for streamers this week, well, Jaden Reed hasn't topped 26 receiving yards once in the last month, though he has been saved by 3 touchdowns in that time. This week, though, he gets the league's best slot matchup in the Lions. Despite his poor usage, he's a must-start option for me. Meanwhile, I've spoken a lot about Jerry Jeudy and his Browns teammates being fantastic pickups this season, and Judy's finally starting to pay off. In fact, I've talked about Jeudy as a stash at least 4 or 5 times so far this season, so hopefully you listened. The Steelers are an awful matchup, but with Jameis Winston at the helm, I'm starting Jeudy regardless. And actually, realistically, while the Steelers have been very good defensively, their one weakness has been out wide. We saw Levi Wallace get ripped up previously. I do think it is possible they struggle again this week. Meanwhile, Darnell Mooney takes on the Vikings. And after a pair of tough matchups and a bye week, look, we've really cooled off on that Darnell Mooney hype. But he's still the wide receiver 18 on the season. He faces the league's most generous wide receiver defense in Minnesota. So I'd happily start him in week 14. Meanwhile, plenty of stashes if you're looking forward to the playoffs. Cedric Tillman's a guy I've talked about plenty, and a concussion has halted his hype in the tracks. But it wasn't long ago that this Brown was the guy with 3 consecutive games over 75 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's been dropped in a lot of leagues, but he gets a good playoff schedule. So I'd pick him up and stash him for his upside. After all, we will think of Tillman as being ahead of Jeudy up until Tillman got a concussion. So Tillman is still a very solid guy that you can use. Meanwhile, it's been a season of persistent mediocrity for Jalen Waddle, I should say, falling off a heap of rosters as we approach the fantasy playoffs. But with the Texans and Browns, 2 of the league's best receiver matchups coming up, I think Waddle could be a surprise playoff asset. So if he's available in your league, or if he's still on your bench, then it's worth getting him onto your bench. Meanwhile, the 49ers are midway through a run of tough receiving matchups and are barely getting by with a hobbled Brock Purdy. But with the Rams and Lions popping up on their playoff schedule, I can see a serious bounce back for Juwan Jennings and Deebo Samuel come week 15. In some shallow leagues, you're going to see Deebo and Jennings get dropped. I would be picking them up. And if you've got them on your roster, don't do anything silly. Now, let's talk tight ends. And I've been a Kate Otten fan for a fair while. As people know, I was a fan of him in college when he was coming out as a prospect. Kate Otten's had 7 targets last week and now faces the league's 3rd best tight end matchup in the Raiders. Now, he's a risky start because he didn't do very much with those 7 targets, but so is everybody at the position. So I'm putting him out there if I need a week 14 fill-in. And if I can't get Otten, well, Will Disley put up an unsurprising donut in week 13, but he now faces the league's best tight end matchup in the Chiefs. So it's arguably the Chiefs, maybe the Panthers, depending on the scoring setting. Now, remember, this is the team that Brock Bowers blasted for 30 PPR points last week. The Chiefs are. I wouldn't anticipate that sort of performance out of Disley, but if you're desperate for a streamer who'll likely be available after waivers run, Disley is a good option. Meanwhile, if you're not thinking about this week, but you're trying to think forward as to an upside tight end, I do like Juwan Johnson. It's entirely possible that the injury of Taysom Hill could lead to a big bump in routes and targets for the existing tight ends in New Orleans. I expect a lot of 12 personnel with Fabian Moreau staying into block and Juwan Johnson going out and getting receptions. So you can pick him up and just see what happens if you're struggling at the position. Maybe you just got a Taysom Hill injury. Maybe Dallas got it. Is creating issues because he's injured at the moment. So I think Juwan Johnson's an option to pick up. You can start him if you're desperate this week, but you can also stash him if there aren't a lot of options available, but you at least have a starter at the moment. Kickers and DSTs, and Chase McLaughlin, well, he paid off as a streamer last week, so I'm going straight back to the well. The Raiders have conceded the most points to kickers so far this season, and McLaughlin is on fire. This is a matchup made in heaven. Meanwhile, Jake Elliott, well, he's taking on the Panthers. I say this every week, start the kicker taking on the Panthers. Now, I don't typically love starting Jake Elliott because they go for it so much on 4th and 1 and 4th and 2 in Philly, but I don't know, against the Panthers, it's just a great matchup. If you can't get either of those guys, then get either Parker Romo or Will Reichard, whichever one is actually starting, against the Falcons this week. The Falcons are the league's second best kicking matchup, and Parker Romo has been very solid, and Will Reichard was good before that. So whichever one is going to start, and it's unclear which it is at this point in time, they will be a solid option. You could pick up Romo and then grab Reichert when the news becomes available, or do it vice versa. Just don't grab both because that's a total waste. Finally, DSTs. And look, I don't feel great about most of the DSTs this week, but I do like this one. Tampa Bay Buccaneers against the Raiders. Aiden O'Connell is a good quarterback to target if you need a DST this week. So I'm backing the Bucs to offer plenty of sacks and keep the score relatively low against Vegas. Meanwhile, we know that the Giants were already a top 3 DST matchup, and then they released Daniel Jones. So this feels like a nice, safe week for the Saints as they take on Drew Lock or potentially Tommy DeVito. And that's all we've got for streamers and stashes for week 14. As always, if you've got any questions, hit me up in the comments below, or just let me know how your team's going and flex your playoff situation. You can also message me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down anytime you've got start set advice. I'm happy to help you out there. Or you can check us out on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. My rankings are over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can also check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. And finally, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. I'll be back in a couple of days' time, and we will be talking start and sit options for week 14. I look forward to seeing you then.